Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. We'll let our attendees trickle in for the next minute or so, and then we will get started. All right, let's get started, everyone. So first of all, thank you all for coming to our final Beyond Bytown lecture of the fall 2023 season. My name is Megan McCrae, and I am the Bytown Museum Program Coordinator and your host for tonight. I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Sachiko Okuda, to discuss the history, experiences, and traditions of Ottawa's Japanese community with us tonight. So while we're meeting virtually, it remains important to recognize the land the Bytown Museum, the commissariat, resides on. The City of Ottawa, the Ottawa Lock, and the Bytown Museum are both the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin. The peoples of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this place. The Bytown Museum honors the peoples and the land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. So now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Sachiko. Sachiko is a lifelong community volunteer, and she's president of the Ottawa Japanese Community Association. She volunteered for newcomers to Canada and was originally from Montreal, but has lived in Ottawa for 4 decades now. So our lecture will begin with a presentation from Sachiko, and then we will dive into a Q&A session. So if you're watching from Facebook live stream and have a question, please drop a comment and we'll get to it as well. But if you're in the actual Zoom lecture, feel free to use the Q&A, the Q&A box, and we'll get to the question during the session. But I will now pass it off to Sachiko for her PowerPoint.
Okay, thanks very much, Megan. And I thank the Bytown Museum for this opportunity to share the community history of the Japanese Canadians in Ottawa. We're a small but mighty community, and I say mighty because I hope to convince you that we punch above our weight in terms of diversity and also in our contributions, particularly in the arts. I identify as a Nikkei Sansei, a person of Japanese origin, 3rd generation. I'm not a historian, but for almost 2 decades, I helped members of our community tell their stories on our monthly TV show, Contact Japan. And community TV taught me a lot about time. So heads up, I know I told many of you that I'd be speaking for 30 minutes. It's going to be longer, but I commit to delivering value for your time. Any errors in this presentation belong to me, and I apologize to the Ottawa Japanese Canadian community as a whole and the individuals profiled in the presentation. I had to leave out so much. 本当にごめんなさい. Moving forward, let's try to find ways to capture more of our stories for the benefit of the generations that will follow us. The presentation is divided into 4 parts. Slide, please. Or am I controlling the slides, Megan?
Nope, I got it.
Okay. Some facts and figures about our community today. Our origin story. So like most ethnocultural communities in Canada, our national community was shaped by immigration policy, but additionally, the community in Ottawa was shaped by what is commonly, though controversially, known as the Japanese Canadian internment. I will talk about the internment, and I do use that term, and I'll also address the controversy around the term. The third section is a slice of time, so 4 formative decades in Ottawa, and a celebration of our diversity as illustrated by profiles of our community members. Slide, please. A word about terminology. I use Japanese Canadians unhyphenated interchangeably with Nikkei, although they don't mean quite the same thing, but they're close enough. And some community members identify themselves as Japanese, but I don't personally because I don't speak Japanese. Finally, a word about our generational labels. Slide, please. For some of us, these are very important. It's one of the first things I ask a Japanese Canadian when I meet them for the first time, but they're not meaningful for everyone. So if you or your kids have ever practiced Japanese martial arts, you probably know how to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 4, 5. We use these numbers to designate generations. 1世、2世、3世、4世、5世. And if you've practiced martial arts, you'll also know the term sensei, master. This is not the same thing as sansei, 3rd generation. So there are other generational labels that people use as well, and we'll see some of those in the presentation. Okay, let's get started. The Ottawa Japanese Canadian community is small. Put another way, if the entire population of Ottawa-Gatineau were 1,000 people, the Nikkei population would be represented by a pregnant Japanese-speaking recent immigrant, the baby she's carrying, who would almost certainly be mixed race, and an unrelated man, because Nikkei tend not to marry other Nikkei. And he would not speak Japanese because, like me, he would be the descendant of a pre-war immigrant. Slide, please. Ottawa-Gatineau comprises less than 3% of our total Nikkei population in Canada, but at 3,725, we rank 7th in terms of cities with Nikkei populations, meaning that we are a small community amongst other small communities, with the exception of Vancouver and Toronto, which together comprise more than half of the total Nikkei population in Canada. Slide. We are recent arrivals to Canada and to Ottawa. The first Japanese settler to Canada is commonly believed to be Manzo Nagano, who arrived on the West Coast in 1877, although certainly there were shipwrecked sailors who landed there before Confederation. In Ottawa, the first known permanent Nikkei resident arrived in the mid-1930s, and by 1941, there were 3 Nikkei in Ottawa. And to the best of my knowledge, the next slide shows them. Okay, so the scratched microfiche image shows a business listing for Henry Akamatsu at Lumo Electric on Somerset Street. He's the one who arrived in the mid-1930s. Next to Henry is Edith Ikeda, the first Nisei federal government employee who arrived here in 1940. And beside Edith is Bill Iwasaki, who worked at the Japanese legation. I believe Mary, his bride, arrived in Ottawa shortly after their marriage in 1941, but probably after the census was taken. So she'd be the fourth resident. Slide, please. We don't marry other Nikkei. According to a 2011 study by StatsCan, of all visible minority groups, Japanese Canadians were by far the most likely to be in a conjugal relationship with a person from another group, almost 80%. So the table shows the percentage of actual what we call mixed unions in 2011. But that includes marriages that from decades earlier, when Nikkei still married one another. The current rate of intermarriage is much higher. Some say 95%, but I couldn't verify that statistic in time for this presentation. Why don't we marry each other? I see two reasons. The forced diaspora, the great scattering of Nikkei from BC after the internment, that resulted in a high rate of mixed unions amongst the baby boomer generation, like me. You don't tend to marry other Nikkei if you don't know any. And the second reason for our high intermarriage rate is in recent decades, most new Japanese immigrants are women who marry non-Nikkei Canadians. What's the impact of our high intermarriage rate? It's diversity in the form of mixed race children. Slide, please. If you meet a Japanese Canadian in Ottawa, don't be surprised if they say they can't speak Japanese. According to the 2021 census, although there were over 1,000 people in Ottawa-Gatineau who had Japanese as their mother tongue, the actual usage of Japanese in the home dropped to 430, and that's largely a function of mixed unions. Slide, please. So last month, I conducted an unscientific survey of Japanese proficiency among members of our Tomonokai seniors group, circle of friends. Many Tomonokai members spoke Japanese as children, and yet of the 21 survey respondents, only 3 rated their Japanese as higher than poor. So why is that? It could be that we underrate ourselves. And some members explained that they stopped speaking Japanese when they started school, and that's a common immigrant family narrative. But at least one other sensei and I firmly believe that we stopped using Japanese in part because of the wartime treatment of our community. We did not want to stick out. There's a Japanese expression, deru kui wa utareru. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. However, use of Japanese in our community is on the rebound, and it's not only because of immigration. When I enrolled at Glebe Collegiate Institute for my umpteenth time at trying to learn Japanese, I was astonished at the proficiency of the other students, none of whom were Nikkei, but all of whom were passionate about Japanese pop culture. But bottom line, for Japanese Canadians in Ottawa, do not judge us too harshly if we say we cannot speak Japanese. Okay. Now we'll move on to the next part of the presentation, our origin story. As mentioned, the Japanese Canadian community in Canada was shaped by immigration policy. And the community in Ottawa was shaped by the forced diaspora from BC. Next slide, please. As for immigration, in rough terms and using a lot of water metaphors, Japanese immigration to Canada can be characterized by 2 waves, separated by a long dry spell. This chart covers the years 1900 to 1988, although immigration started before 1900. The first wave reached a tsunami in 1908 of 7,600 immigrants before slowing to a trickle in the late 1920s when the annual quota was capped at 150. Then there's about a 40-year dry spell. And as you can see, the tap is turned off completely during the World War II and in its wake. And the second wave, a smaller wave, starts in the late 1960s with a small but uninterrupted stream of immigration that in recent years has leveled off to about 1,000 a year, mostly women who marry non-Nikkei. So what does this mean? The long dry spell is responsible for an additional layer of diversity in our community, creating two cohorts: pre-World War II immigrants and their descendants, like me, whose families experienced the Japanese-Canadian internment, and post-1960s immigrants and their descendants, whose families did not experience the Japanese-Canadian internment. In Ottawa, we speak of the arrival of the scientists in the 1960s because Canada had adopted a points-based system for immigration that favored professionals and specialized workers. Okay, next slide, please. So now we'll move on to the internment. What is it exactly, and why is the term controversial? Essentially, in December of 1941, when Canada declared war on Japan and when there were 3 Nikkei in Ottawa, approximately 22,000 Japanese Canadians lived within 100 miles of the West Coast. By October 31st, 1942, all of them were gone. Sent to internment camps, sugar beet farms in Alberta and Manitoba, prisoner of war camps such as the one in Angler in Northern Ontario, and to other places. And because Japanese Canadians were barred from the West Coast until April 1st, 1949, many came east and some eventually settled in Ottawa. And this was all made possible by the application of the War Measures Act. Next slide, please. The term internment is commonly used to refer to the period 1942 to April 1st, 1949, but it's misleading because a country cannot intern its own citizens. And Anne Sunahara, historian and Ottawa community member, she abhors this term because it perpetuates the fiction that those affected were not Canadian, when in fact the majority were. Anne literally wrote the book on the systemic racism towards Japanese Canadians, The Politics of Racism, and she has generously made the updated 2020 edition freely available on the internet at japanesecanadianhistory.ca. Next slide, please. I dislike the term internment because although I use it, it doesn't go far enough to describe what I call the 4 Ds: forced dispersal, forced dispossession, deportation, and the post-war diaspora. And as an aside, some people use the term forced dispersal or internment era instead of the internment. Okay. Next slide, please. So to illustrate the 4 Ds, I thought I'd show you some family photos that I found in a box about 10 years ago when my aunt moved into a nursing home. And the place names that I'm going to mention are the names of camps, not found on any map because they don't exist anymore, okay? This photo, I believe, is Popoff, but the photo was unlabeled. So if anybody knows for sure, maybe you could let us know. You could put it in the chat. Okay, next slide, please. So here's my cousin in Minto in 1945. And next to my cousin are 2 of my aunts. One's a teenager in the photo in matching outfits that they no doubt sewed themselves. And the group of 4, it's 2 of my aunts and 2 of their friends. And they are likely in Popoff, okay? And the next slide, please. And this slide is of my father in Tashmi and some of his siblings in Popoff. When I found these photos, I thought, wow, everybody's nicely dressed. And they look, happy, and they look healthy. And, must have been that fresh mountain air. But then I realized that these pictures, they're posed. And somebody I showed them to said it's like selfies or Facebook. You put on a good face. So what is really in the photos are young Canadian-born Nikkei who were stuck in the mountains, seemingly not accustomed to snow, and except for the baby, were fully aware that their rights were being trampled upon. Next slide, please. This slide shows the second D, forced dispossession. So here's an example. This is a letter that my maternal grandmother received in Toronto in 1946, notifying her that the Berry farm that belonged to her husband, who had died in Bay Farm, had been sold to make way for veterans housing, and that she would receive $46.97 from the sale. And there are many dispossession stories like this one. The next slide shows the deportation. In 1946, 4,000 Japanese Canadians were deported to Japan before public outcry put a stop to the shipments. And the final slide in this set is of the diaspora. The diaspora created the Ottawa community because, as we saw in that wave chart of immigration, there was virtually no immigration from Japan from the late 1920s until the mid-1960s. And this is a famous quote by a federal cabinet minister. Okay, so that's the internment. Now, for a change of mood, let's move on to the more positive story of the Japanese Canadian community in Ottawa. So for this section, I tread lightly, but I borrow heavily from this pictorial history book and from recent interviews and email exchanges with community members. Next slide, please. In the 1950s, okay, by 1951, the community was 24, right, from that chart, with more coming each year, mainly for employment. And these were young people coming for employment without their parents. And by 1953, a social club was officially formed called the Ottawa Japanese Canadian Club to hold parties and dances and picnics. One member of the club refers to this period as the dating years. And one of the challenges to organizing events in this time was the disproportionate number of single males to females in Ottawa. The club minutes refer this to the shortage of girls. So invitations were sent to the Montreal Nisei Fellowship group. And this lovely photo shows a joint Ottawa-Montreal party in 1955. Next slide, please. The next slide shows a photo of a Christmas dinner for singles at the home of Jack and Sadie Nakamoto. Next slide, please. There were also sports-based activities, bowling, a basketball event, followed by the formation of additional clubs in the 60s and 70s. Go, bridge, Bible study, ikebana, curling, and more. So this photo of a curling event from the 1950s predates the formation of the Nikkei Curling Club at the Lansdowne Curlodrome. But I love this photo because of the formal attire of those in the photo. Okay, let's move on to picnics. At the last Tomonokai, the seniors group event, I was told that I had to feature the picnics in this presentation, the first of which was held in 1954 at McGregor Lake. These pictures are from the 1970s. By that time, those singles from the 1950s and 60s were married with children. And you can see why the Tomonokai loved the picnics. Look at this horde of children. So moving on, we'll go to 1970, the next slide. This beautiful portrait shows some members of Mas Takahashi's family. Mas Takahashi's parents, Tina Takahashi in the middle. Tina has her own martial arts center on Maryvale Road. And June and Mas Takahashi, the founders of the Takahashi Dojo. So when I mentioned to Tomonokai that I would be featuring the dojo as an early community gathering place, I was told I also had to mention the Takahashi family's groundbreaking contributions to martial arts in Canada. And here's my disclaimer. I can't do them justice because their contributions are truly dizzying. The Takahashi immediate and extended family and the generations of students they have trained are holders of innumerable national and international titles. Next slide, please. The family boasts several Olympians, and they have trained other Olympians and Paralympians and many families. So you see in the detail from the photo wall from the Takahashi dojo, a picture of Mas Takahashi, Pierre-Éliott Trudeau, and his son, Justin Trudeau. The Takahashi family has also co-authored a book, still available in ebook format for Kindle reader. Next slide, please. And now I'll move on to the dojo as a community hub. So Alan Takahashi, the oldest son, told me that his parents looked at many buildings before choosing 5 Melrose in Hintonburg, because although it had enclosed offices in it, it didn't have any pillars. And the family, together with friends, literally broke down the walls to create the dojo. And I think the breaking down of walls to create a large open space is a fitting metaphor for the significance of the dojo to our community. In the early days, the dojo hosted a small restaurant, and they also operated a small Japanese grocery store until the Nakanishi family were able to open their grocery store on Somerset. Perhaps some of you remember the Japan food store on Somerset between Lyne and Kent. It closed in the late 90s. The dojo has hosted many parties, wonderful ikebana and art exhibitions by the late Mitsuki Kikuchi. You can see some of his paintings in this photo. Kikuchi sensei died this past March. And the Takahashis have made their space available for life drawing classes, the community Minyo dance group, and more recently, the Yosakoi dance troupe and other community activities. Next slide, please. The caption on this photo of the dojo says Project Headquarters, and the project was the pictorial history book, which I'm using so extensively for this presentation. Okay, next slide. We've looked at the community coming together internally in the 1950s and 60s, and now I'm going to characterize the next decades as more outward facing. By 1977, 10 years after Canada had celebrated its centennial, Japanese Canadians celebrated the centennial of Manzo Nagano's arrival in Canada. I'm going to highlight 2 organizations that were launched in Ottawa during the Japanese Canadian centennial year and 2 public events. Next slide, please. The first organization is the Ottawa Japanese Community Association, the OJCA, which grew out of the ad hoc committee to oversee centennial events. Here is a recent description from the OJCA president. The OJCA works locally and nationally on initiatives and events that bring the community together, celebrate our history and achievements in Canada, Japanese culture and heritage, and foster collaboration with others to support equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the OJCA is a member organization of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, the NAJC, which negotiated the Japanese-Canadian Redress Agreement that I'll talk about shortly. Next slide, please. The next organization, founded in 1977 and still thriving today, is the Ottawa Japanese Language School, which offers Japanese language lessons on Saturdays to children, teens, and adults. In the picture, we can see some current members of the Tomonokai refreshing their childhood Japanese at the time at Brookfield High School, although the OJLS operates out of a different high school now. Next slide, please. And as for events, the first one I'll highlight is a historical photo exhibition and accompanying workshop, set of workshops hosted at the Canadian Museum of Nature in 1977. The photo exhibition was curated out of Vancouver, but the workshops, exhibitions, and demonstrations like kite making, dolls, origami, paper folding, sumie, brush painting, ikebana, floral arrangement, and martial arts, they were all organized locally. It was a huge showcase for the Ottawa Japanese Canadian community at a national institution. And the second event that launched in 1977 is Mochitsuki. Next slide, please, Megan, which today remains the largest annual public event on the Ottawa Japanese Canadian calendar. So what's Mochitsuki? Essentially, it's a party that revolves around pounding of rice into mochi, not mochi ice cream, but chewy mochi. Okay, so we have a little video. I hope it works coming up. Nowadays, this is how most people make mochi, with a machine that steams the rice and it jiggles it around into mochi. Oh, I can't see the jiggling. No problem. It shakes it into mochi. Oh, here we go. All righty, we can move on. But here's the traditional equipment. The usu, the giant mortar, and the kine, a giant mallet. This usu and kine belong to our beloved Japanese restaurant, C'est Japon à Suisha, which closed permanently this past summer. And Alan Takahashi, who's in the photo, said it took four judo practitioners to lift it and bring it over to the dojo where it now resides. Next slide, please. So since we don't always have four judoka, around to haul equipment, our community has improvised with its unique version of portable usu. The prototype was made by Yaichiro Goto and Ikuo Kambayashi, and it's similar to this one, the one in this 1982 picture from Mochitsuki. Next slide, please, Megan. Here are more pictures, this time from the 2019 Mochitsuki, showing the audience watching the community showcase of entertainment. And the next slide shows other pictures of a family, audience participation, dancing with me in center with pre-COVID hair. Some of the crafts and also the Japanese goods that are for sale, and the smiling volunteers who sell them. I asked Tomonokai, the seniors group, right, why they love Mochitsuki, because honestly, it represents a staggering amount of work. And some of the words that they used were get together, communal, tradition, and showcase. Next slide, please. And you are all invited. The 2023 edition of Mochitsuki is on December 10th in Little Italy, and it will feature traditional foods, great entertainment, and a host of community and commercial vendors of Japanese-related goods. For more information on Mochitsuki, check the OJCA website, www.ogca.ca. Next slide, please, Megan. This is the final historical marker in this section. It's Japanese Canadian redress, which was achieved in 1988. And I'm going to highlight two events: the Parliament Hill Rally in April of 1988 and the signing of the redress agreement in September of the same year. Next, so we'll stay on this slide. After years of advocacy led by the NAJC to obtain redress for the injustices suffered from 1942 to 1949, in April 1988, a very moving rally took place in Ottawa. Hundreds of survivors of the internment, some quite elderly, and their descendants converged in Ottawa and they rallied on Parliament Hill with placards and these beautiful ribbons of hope, which the streamers that represented the 10,000 survivors who had already died. It was very moving and very dignified. And in the photo to the right, you see Kei Shimizu in the white coat. We'll talk about Kei in a moment. I believe the Ottawa rally, in which members of the local community, such as Molly and Aki Watanabe and others, played very significant roles, was a turning point in the redress campaign. Next slide, please. And on September 22nd, 1988, then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney signed the Comprehensive Redress Agreement in Ottawa 4 decades after the end of the Japanese-Canadian internment. The redress agreement included an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a fund for community development projects, and symbolic individual payments of $21,000 to the remaining 12,000 survivors. But what historian Anne Sunahara chose to highlight to me in a conversation recently was the replacement of the War Measures Act so that other groups would not suffer the harms inflicted upon Japanese Canadians. Next slide, please. This is a quote about redress by well-known author Joy Kogawa, whose 1981 novel, Obasan, tells the story of the wartime treatment of Japanese Canadians. According to Joy, the importance of redress is that it restored the survivors. And I can't speak for the entire community, but I'm confident that my own father, whose life was so badly altered because of the internment, did feel restored, and he did cross over and embrace reconciliation. We're going to the final section of the presentation. It's a celebration of diversity in our small community in the form of profiles of a cross-section of members across different generations. Okay, so the first profile is of Kei Shimizu. Next slide, please. Kei is the woman who was carrying the ribbons of hope at the redress rally. I think there's a slide before it, Megan. Kei and her late husband, Kunio, thank you, were community pioneers who came to Ottawa, Gatineau around 1950. Kei was born in Kingham Inlet, BC. It's an Indigenous settlement, and her father was a fisherman, and he had docked the family's boat in the inlet. So that is her, registered as her place of birth. And it is also the source of many of the totem poles that used to be on display at the UBC Museum of Anthropology, but they have been returned. Next slide, please. In the fall of 1941, after completing a BA, Kei enrolled in the social work program at UBC just before Canada declared war on Japan. And in 1942, she was recruited by the BC Security Commission to work as a social worker in Hastings Park because she spoke Japanese as well as English. Hastings Park comprised the livestock barns and other buildings at the Pacific National Exhibition in Vancouver, and it served as temporary housing for 8,000 Japanese Canadians while they were waiting to be shipped out to the camps. And once Hastings Park was closed, Kei provided social work services in Kaslo, New Denver, Slocan, and Tashmi. Next slide, please. But in 1943, because she felt conflicted about working for the BC Security Commission, Kei resigned and she moved east to work as a domestic servant. In 1942, the commission launched a domestic servants program to encourage self-sufficiency amongst Japanese Canadians and to get them out of BC. And I believe Kei was part of the program. And I love the quote in the green text box from the commission about the domestics. It's so patronizing. After the war, Kei and her husband raised their family in Ottawa, and Kei worked for the Children's Aid Society. She and her husband were community leaders, and they were instrumental in welcoming other Nikkei to Ottawa. And in the 80s, 1980s, Kay was active in the Japanese Canadian redress movement. Next slide, please. She understood that many Japanese Canadians who worked for the public service did not want to be seen as criticizing their employers. So this is what she said in an undated interview in some private papers. A small group of Nisei in Ottawa felt that the federal government needed to respond to the request for redress. And eventually we were able to influence others to our way of thinking. And one thing I appreciate about Kay, one of the many things I appreciate about Kay, is that over the course of her long and courageous life, she devoted time to participate in history projects. And here is a picture of her from last summer at the age of 103, and an image of some of her handwritten papers. I'm going to move a bit more quickly through the next profiles. Next slide, please. So here is another community member who has had a long and fascinating life. Ayaz Agish in Tokyo in 1934. His parents, Hassan and Hanifa, were born in Russia and Manchuria, respectively, and they were at the forefront of the Western garment trade in Japan. In particular, Hanifa did a brisk trade in women's blouses, skirts, and underwear. Ayaz's mother tongue is Tatar. He says it's similar to the Uyghur language, and he also speaks Japanese, Turkish, and English. He and his brother left for Turkey in 1954 after living throughout the World War II in Japan. And after a 22-year career in the airline industry, Ayaz married Jerry, a Canadian diplomat. Ayaz worked in the Canadian embassy in Bonn and then in Tokyo, where they were posted for 5 years. And their daughter, Suzanne, is a Canadian diplomat, and she's presently posted in Beijing. Next slide, please. Ayaz is Muslim, and he's not ethnically Japanese, but he was born in Japan, and he lived there for a total of 25 years. And he speaks Japanese fluently. And he worked part-time for a time in Ottawa as a Japanese tour guide. He participates in Japanese community events. Here he is at our picnic, and is a former treasurer of the Canada-Japan Society of Ottawa. And he says when he cooks Japanese food at home, he feels Japanese. Our next profile is of Machiko Townsend, who was born in Arita, Japan, the birthplace of Japanese porcelain. Her grandmother was a porcelain painter, and Machiko studied art history at the University of Regina and the University of Victoria before coming to Ottawa with her family. She is a freelance art curator and translator, and one recent work she translated into Japanese is the book, The Politics of Painting, Fascism and Japanese Art During the Second World War. Next slide, please. Machiko is thoroughly engaged in local community life, and recently she became the Japanese co-host of Contact Japan, our community TV show. And here she is in a photo with artist Norman Takeuchi, whose profile is next. Norman is an artist based in Nepean who has received a lot of media attention this year because of his extraordinary 60-year retrospective now on at the Ottawa Art Gallery until March 2024. Norman's mother was born in Vancouver, but his father was born in Kochi in Japan. And in 1942, the family was forcibly relocated to the largely white community of Westwold between Vernon and Kamloops. And then they moved around in the BC interior until eventually returning to Vancouver in the 50s. Next slide, please. For the first 3 decades of his life, nothing in Norman's art betrayed his Japanese heritage because, as he says, of the humiliation of the internment and the derogatory depiction of Japanese in comic books and other popular culture when he was growing up. But in the late 1990s, he began an intensive exploration of Japanese culture and Japanese Canadian history. And you can see the results of this exploration in his exhibition at the Ottawa Art Gallery. And this past summer, he was named to the Order of Canada for his enduring commitment to honoring, preserving, and sharing the history and heritage of Japanese Canadians. Next slide, please. This is Derek Akito Townsend. He's 13 years old, born in Japan. He is of mixed race origin, and he's the son of Sachiko Townsend, the curator and art translator. He loves basketball. He plays AAA basketball for the Nepean Blue Devils. And I want to contrast Derek to Norman because unlike young Norman, who was humiliated by the depiction of Japanese people in popular culture, Derek is brimming with pride for manga and anime. Of course, this is partly a function of the world's embrace of Japanese pop culture, but the contrast between young Norman and young Derek is striking, and I just wanted to highlight it in the presentation. I love Derek's confidence. We have a couple more profiles. The next one is Nora Nishikawa, who was born in Ottawa. So Nora is a baby boomer sansei whose parents, Nick and May, were among the Japanese Canadian community founders in Ottawa. And Nora is a font of knowledge about our history and our local community. She also has a valuable store of ephemera and records, event programs, minutes, some of which are featured in the presentation. Next slide, please. And I did not know until she showed me this recent composite photo by the late Giselle Holloway that Nora is a truly amazing home cook. She didn't make everything in the photos. Her friends contributed, but she made most of it. Next slide, please. And here she is in a photo from a 1977 centennial event at the Museum of Nature. And in the newspaper clipping, it's her father in the white shirt at Mochitsuki preparing mochi. Okay, our final profile is of Kaylee Hatashita, who is also born in Ottawa. Kaylee is a mixed-race Japanese-Canadian whose grandparents were born in Canada, moved to Japan, and then moved back to Canada after Kaylee's father was born. So that's why it's difficult to situate her generationally. Next slide, please. Kaylee is an independent circus artist who performs under the name Kaylee Creatrix. Among her many talents, she is one of only 3 professional sword swallowers in Canada. And last June, she performed some juggling. It's called Daikagura juggling at our community picnic. Next and final slide. I want to conclude with Kaylee's reflections on how she connected with her Japanese heritage and the Japanese Canadian community through her art. So when I set out to represent diversity in our community, I didn't intend to pick up on the through line of art, but it just came through. It just so happened that 3 of the 7 profiles are people from the arts community, and that's a lot. And in our increasingly diverse community, because of intermarriage, and as we move further and further away from the internment as a touchstone, I believe it is cultural and artistic pursuits that will form our connective tissue moving forward. And well, I leave you with that conjecture to ponder. And the last slide is an acknowledgement slide. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to everyone who provided input to this presentation, especially the individuals who entrusted their stories to me.
That was outstanding. Thank you so much, Sachiko. That was so insightful, but also quite engaging. I will say, I know we worked on this together, but seeing your family picture still just makes me like so happy looking at that. And I just really am thankful you shared your history and your experiences with the museum and our audience tonight. So thank you so much, very much for that. So we will move on to the question period of our lecture. I see we already have one question in the Q&A box, so I will read that to you.
Okay.
So Edward is asking, is there a preferable alternative to the word internment? I work in the heritage sector and I want to be accurate and correct in my language when discussing this part of Canada's history.
That's a very good question. And Anne Sunahara and I were, we're discussing that, Edward. The Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center in Burnaby, BC uses the forced dispersal, and other people use internment era, but it's
Okay,
maybe we have a little glitch. I don't know.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Can you hear us? Okay.
Yes.
Do you want to go ahead and give your answer again, just in case?
Okay, sure.
You just glitched out.
Okay, sorry about that. In fact, we still haven't come up with a great term. At least Anne Sunahara, the historian, and I were batting that around the other day. The Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, BC uses the forced dispersal. But again, that's not very comprehensive. It's a discussion worth having, and I think we can have it at the level of at the museum level. So my advice would be to engage with the Nikkei National Museum in Burnaby, BC.
Awesome, thanks, Chico. We have some questions piling in. So Andrea says, can you speak to the increase in the Japanese Canadian population from 1961 onwards? From 91 close to 4,000.
Okay. That period of time, the growth of the population came from immigration, and because Canada was no longer setting quotas by country, but was awarding points to certain professions and family situations, the immigration post 1960s was more specialized workers. I cannot say, though, whether people directly came to Ottawa or whether they went to the larger, the hubs of Nikkei population, meaning Toronto and Vancouver.
For sure.
So, Andrea, not a complete answer, but a partial answer.
Awesome. Thanks, Chico. So the third question, how do you think the traumatic experiences of Japanese Canadians during the war affected the way the community was built here in Ottawa?
That's a really great question. I'm going to answer it from my own perspective, and I'm a sansei. I'm a baby boomer sansei, so I'm not. I'm a little younger than the people in that great photo of the dating years, but because Canada was a different place in the 1960s in terms of the embrace of multiculturalism. We weren't there yet, okay? We Japanese Canadians, a lot of us went the assimilation route. So we didn't speak Japanese. We did not want to stand out. We did not want to talk too much about ourselves. And my parents, who would be of that generation who were rebuilding after the Japanese Canadian internment, they did not talk about their wartime experience at all. And that is very, very common in the Japanese Canadian community. So people like myself, who did not experience the internment personally, we had to find out about it by research and by giving presentations such as this.
That's amazing. So the museum's own visitor and community engagement manager, SC, actually has a question. So SC is wondering, over the years, how has the Japanese community in Ottawa celebrated winter and holiday traditions? With winter coming up, it is fun to learn all the different ways people mark the season.
Winter in particular.
Winter and winter and holiday traditions.
Okay, well, I can tell you that Mochitsuki is a winter, it's a New Year's celebration, but we celebrate it now a little bit earlier in December. And how we get ready for it is, weekends previous, preparing foods, preparing crafts, getting all of our volunteers mobilized. The actual pounding of mochi is it's an activity we just look forward to because we do it in the traditional way. Okay, but it is an indoor activity that celebrates the joy of New Year's and getting together.
That's wonderful. I think SC is watching, so I think they will be happy to know about that.
May I say one other thing about winter? Okay.
Sure.
So we have powerhouse ice carvers in our community. And one of them, Mr. Kambayashi, was at the forefront of having ice sculptures at Winterlude. And he and his son are, powerhouses in ice carving.
I think museum for COVID-19, we had ice sculptures at the museum at some point during Winterlude. So there's a bit of a connection there between the community and the museum. So that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I have one final question for you before we log off for the night. So from your own perspective, what do you think is in store for the Ottawa Canadian Japanese community in the future?
Okay, in the future. I think what the future holds for us is diversity. Okay, we are not going to look necessarily Japanese. Our names won't necessarily identify us as Japanese. So we are going to be very diverse. And can I say, excuse me, I realized that I didn't feature the demographic in the profiles, the demographic of those Montreal and Ottawa party people in the 1950s, and that's youth, the youth up to the age of 35, let's say. And, the youth, they are our future, right? And for young Nikkei who are interested in touching base with their heritage or getting involved or meeting other Nikkei, please check out the Japanese Canadian young leaders.
That's awesome. That's a great answer, Sachiko. So on that note, I just want to note that we do have a lot of questions in the Q&A chat, but unfortunately with our time constraints, we can't get to all of them. But I would advise those who enjoyed this lecture to check out any other of Sachiko's presentations or any presentations that the Ottawa Japanese Association are giving. So keep up with their information as well. But I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. It was a wonderful and engaging lecture. Sachiko, you did an amazing job. And I really enjoyed working with you these past months on making this project work. You are inspiring and thoughtful and just an amazing person, well-rounded. So I really have enjoyed our time together. And again, thank you for coming tonight, everyone. Today was our final lecture of the Beyond Bytown fall season, but I think we're gonna start back up again next winter or next spring. So stay tuned to the Bytown Museum's website and our Instagram page for more details. But again, thank you to those who joined today, and Sachiko, thank you again for your presentation. I really enjoyed working with you. It was an amazing night.
Thank you, Megan. I so enjoyed working with you too.
Amazing. Thanks, everyone.